The morning Clara Whitfield fled her husband's ranch with nothing but her 3 children and a carpet bag stuffed with cornbread, and a single change of dress. The Texas sky was the color of a bruise healing slowly, all purple and yellow at the edges where the sun was just beginning to claw its way above the flat, unforgiving horizon. She ran the way a woman runs when she has no choice left, not looking back, not thinking about what she was leaving behind, only thinking about what she was carrying forward, the weight of little Rosie on her hip, Rosie who was only 4 years old and too tired to walk any further, and the stumbling footsteps of 7-year-old Thomas just behind her, and 12-year-old Henry who kept pace beside her with his jaw set tight like a man twice his age, his brown eyes scanning the road ahead as though he expected every shadow to turn into something dangerous. The year was 1879, and the Texas Panhandle was no place for a woman alone, let alone a woman with 3 children, no horse, and a husband who was likely already reaching for his boots, and his rifle back at the Double Cross Ranch 6 miles behind them. Clara had made her decision 3 nights ago when Hector Whitfield had raised his hand to Henry for the first time. Henry, who had only tried to shield his mother from one of his father's storms, who had stepped between them with his thin 12-year-old body and gotten knocked sideways into the kitchen wall for the trouble of it. In that moment, watching her eldest boy slide to the floor with blood on his lip, something inside Clara had gone cold and final, like a door swinging shut and the latch dropping into place. She had stopped feeling afraid and started feeling certain, and certainty in a woman is a more powerful thing than anyone gives it credit for. She had packed the bag in secret, waiting for Hector to drink himself heavy enough to sleep through a thunderstorm, and then she had gathered her children in the dark and they had walked away from the only home they had known. But 6 miles of dirt road in the pre-dawn dark with 1 child on your hip and fear at your back is a very long way, and by the time the sun had fully crested the horizon and the day's heat had begun its slow, merciless rise, Clara's arms were shaking and Thomas had started crying quietly, trying hard to keep the sound small, because even at 7 years old he understood that this was not a morning for noise. "We're all right," Clara told him, though she did not know if that was true. "We are going to be just fine." Henry took his brother's hand without being asked. They came up on the town of Caldwell Creek at 7:30 in the morning, and it was not much to look at: a main street of weathered board buildings, a livery stable, a general store, a saloon that was already letting out its first drinker of the day, a church with a crooked steeple, and a water trough in front of the sheriff's office that the horses drank from while their riders conducted whatever business brought them to town. Clara had been to Caldwell Creek only a handful of times in her 4 years on the Double Cross Ranch, always in Hector's wagon, always under Hector's eye. The people here knew Hector Whitfield. He was not a man who made himself invisible. He drank at the saloon, he did business at the general store, and he had a reputation that was the sort men respect for the wrong reasons. Nobody in this town was going to shelter Clara Whitfield from her own husband without a great deal of convincing, and she was not sure she had the time or the energy for convincing. She was standing at the edge of the main street, catching her breath, Rosie still balanced on her hip and growing heavier by the minute, when she heard the sound of hooves coming up the road behind her and felt her whole body go rigid with something very close to terror. But it was not Hector's roan stallion, and it was not Hector's voice that called out, and when she turned, she saw a man she did not know, coming up the road alone on a tall sorrel horse the color of autumn leaves. He was lean and long in the saddle the way men get who have spent more of their lives on a horse than off one, with a sun-darkened face and dark hair that curled a little at the collar of his worn canvas trail coat. He wore a single Colt revolver at his hip in a plain leather holster, and there was a lasso coiled on his saddle and a bedroll strapped behind it, and everything about him said working cowboy, nothing fancy, nothing dangerous, just a man moving through the world and minding his own. He pulled up when he saw her standing there at the road's edge with her children gathered around her, and he touched the brim of his hat in a polite, automatic gesture. "Morning, ma'am," he said. He had a voice like the low note on a church organ, unhurried and deep, and his dark eyes moved over her in a single quick assessment, not in the way that made a woman feel uncomfortable, but in the careful way of someone who had learned to read a situation fast. He took in the carpet bag, the children, the way she was standing, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You need help?" he asked simply. Clara had told herself she would not cry. She had promised herself that this morning, while she was walking those 6 miles in the dark, she would not cry, she would not beg, she would simply get her children somewhere safe and figure out the rest from there. But the directness of his question, the plain, uncomplicated kindness of it, hit her somewhere she was not prepared for, and her chin trembled once before she got it under control. "I need to get out of this town," she said, "as far as possible and as fast as I can manage." The man was quiet for a moment, looking at her steadily. Then he swung down off the sorrel with the easy, practiced motion of a man who has done it 10,000 times, and he stood on the road beside her, hat in hand, and his eyes were serious and calm and very dark. "My name is Eli Calloway," he said. "I'm heading north to Dodge City, and I have got no particular reason to rush. If you need to go somewhere safe, can get you and yours there." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had learned in her years with Hector to be very careful about men who offered things. She had learned that kindness could be a kind of trap, but there was something in Eli Calloway's face that she could not find an angle in. No calculation, no hunger, just a straightforward human concern that seemed to cost him nothing to offer and nothing to withhold. "Take the children too," she begged, because she needed to hear it said out loud. She needed him to know exactly what he was agreeing to, not just her but all of them, all 3 of them, Rosie and Thomas and Henry, and whatever trouble might be following close behind. Eli Calloway looked at all 3 of the children in turn, little Rosie with her tangled dark hair and her mother's large eyes blinking at him, Thomas with his tear-streaked face and his hand gripped tight in his brother's, and Henry with that 12-year-old jaw set firm and his eyes full of a wariness no child should carry. Eli looked at each of them, and then he simply nodded. "All 3, he confirmed, and the way he said it made it sound like it had never been a question. His name, he told her as he helped them onto the sorrel, lifting Rosie up first, then Thomas, and letting Henry climb up himself with the pride that mattered to a 12-year-old boy, was Eli Calloway, and he had been born in Missouri in 1848, which made him 31 years old, and he had been working cattle drives and ranch work for most of his adult life, and was currently between jobs, heading north to see about a position at a ranch outside Dodge City that a friend had written him about. He walked beside the horse rather than ride, because the horse was already carrying 3 children and the morning was cool enough yet, and Clara walked beside him with the carpet bag and tried to think practically about what came next. "My husband will come looking," she said, because he needed to know that too. "I expect he will," Eli said. "He is not a gentle man," she said. "Did not suppose he was," Eli said. He did not sound alarmed or deterred by any of this, and Clara found herself studying his profile in the growing morning light, the strong straight line of his nose, the clean angle of his jaw under a few days of dark stubble, the way his mouth was set in an expression of quiet thought. He was not the handsomest man she had ever seen, but there was something solid and unhurried about him that felt, to a woman who had spent 4 years living inside a constant storm, like standing in the eye of calm weather. "Where are you trying to get to?" he asked. "I have a sister in Abilene," Clara said. "We were not allowed to correspond." Hector did not permit correspondence that he had not read first. She said it plainly, without embarrassment, because shame about Hector Whitfield was something she had decided she would not carry anymore. "Do not know if she is still there, but the last I heard she was married to a man named Davies who kept a hardware store. Abilene is northeast of here, Eli said, turning it over. We can make Abilene in 4 or 5 days, depending on the weather and the road. You would take us all the way to Abilene. He glanced at her sideways, and there was a brief flicker of something in his expression that might have been amusement, though it was gentle rather than condescending. I said I would get you somewhere safe, he said. Abilene sounds a fair sight safer than standing on the road outside Caldwell Creek. They traveled all that first morning without stopping, putting distance between themselves and the town. The Texas Panhandle rolled out around them in long, flat waves of yellow-brown grass and pale sky, and the heat climbed steadily as the morning wore on, and Eli traded Rosie from the horse to his arms when the little girl got fussy and restless, carrying her against his chest with the ease of a man who was not self-conscious about it, while Thomas and Henry rode the sorrel in a kind of awed silence. They stopped at midday beside a narrow creek that ran clear and cold over a bed of flat stones, and Eli unpacked a set of simple trail supplies from his saddlebags: dried beef, hardtack, a small pot for boiling water, and Clara unpacked her cornbread, and they sat together in the shade of a cluster of cottonwood trees and ate a meal that was modest enough but felt, to Clara, like something close to a feast simply because it was peaceful. Thomas, emboldened by the food, and the fact that the scary morning seemed to have settled into something less frightening, began asking Eli questions with the rapid-fire enthusiasm of a 7-year-old who has discovered a willing audience. "Have you ever been in a gunfight?" Thomas asked. "Once or twice," Eli said. "Did you win?" "I am here eating cornbread, so I suppose I did," Eli said, and Thomas considered this with great satisfaction. "How many cows have you herded?" "More than I've had time to count." "Are there Indians?" "There are Comanche and Kiowa in these parts, yes," Eli said, and he glanced at Clara when he said it, and she saw in his eyes both the truth of the answer and the careful awareness of not wanting to frighten the boy. "But the days when the trails were most dangerous have settled somewhat. The big wars on the southern plains ended not so long ago, and most of the tribes have been pushed north and west. We should have safe enough passage." Henry had been listening to all of this with his careful, watchful eyes, and now he said in his deliberate 12-year-old voice, "Were they treated fairly? The Comanche and the Kiowa?" Eli looked at the boy with what Clara could only describe as respect. "No," he said, simply and honestly. "They were not. This land was theirs before it was anyone else's, and what was done to take it from them was not a proud chapter in the history of this country. No, they were not treated fairly." Henry nodded, absorbing this, and Clara felt something loosen in her chest, some tight, worried knot she carried for her eldest boy, because he was the kind of child who needed to be spoken to honestly, who could detect condescension or evasion at remarkable distances, and the fact that this stranger on the road had simply told him the truth mattered more than she could have said. They were back on the road by mid-afternoon, and Clara took a turn on the horse while Eli still walked, and she felt strange and a little guilty about it, riding while he walked. But he dismissed her protest with a brief, practical logic. The horse was fresh enough and would tire faster if it carried an adult along with the children than if it did not, and he was a man who made his living walking trails, and he was accustomed to it. By the time the sun began its long, orange slide toward the western horizon, they had made good time, and Eli chose a camp spot with the expert assessment of someone who had slept under open sky more often than under a roof, a shallow depression in the earth that would shelter them from the night wind, near enough to a sparse stand of trees to provide some cover, but not so close that they could not see in all directions. He built a fire with quiet efficiency, and while he did, Clara sat with Rosie in her lap, combing the child's tangled hair with her fingers and thinking about the distance between herself and Hector Whitfield, and whether it was enough yet, and whether it would ever be quite enough. "He will ride hard," she said, when the children were asleep. Thomas had gone out like a candle, curled in his bedroll that Eli had improvised from his own blanket, and an extra canvas he kept strapped to the saddle. Rosie slept against Clara's side, small and warm and trusting. Henry had refused sleep for another hour, sitting up with his back against the sorrel's saddle, while Eli described for him the mechanism of a cattle drive and the work of a trail boss, until finally the boy's eyes had closed in the middle of a sentence, and he had slept. Now it was only Clara and Eli on opposite sides of the fire, the night sky above them enormous and completely crowded with stars in the way that only the Texas sky can manage. And she said it again, because she needed to be honest with him about what they were riding away from. "He has a fast horse and he knows this country better than I do," she said, "and he will be angry." "I have dealt with angry men before," Eli said. "Not this kind," Clara said, and she heard something in her own voice that embarrassed her, a kind of old, exhausted fear that she did not want this man to see, and she pressed her lips together. Eli was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. Then he said without looking up, "How long were you with him?" "4 years," she said. "Henry is from before. His father died of a fever when Henry was 7. She paused. "Thomas and Rosie are Hector's." She did not know why she said that last part. Perhaps because she wanted him to know the full truth of it, that she was not only fleeing a bad man, she was carrying his children away from him. And that was the kind of thing a man could use against a woman in a court of law in 1879, because a husband's rights in this state were still considered to extend rather far. Eli looked up at her then, and his expression was unhurried and thoughtful, and he said, "A father who puts his hands on his wife in front of his children has given up whatever claim the law might think he still holds. Those are your children, and you are a woman who walked 6 miles in the dark to keep them safe. That tells me everything I need to know about who those children belong to." Clara stared at him across the fire, and she thought, very unexpectedly, that she could not remember the last time a man had said something to her that landed exactly in the place where she actually needed to hear it. Hector had spoken plenty of words in 4 years, loud ones and quiet ones and ones that cut, but none of them had ever felt like they saw her. "Thank you," she said, and it came out quieter than she intended. "Get some sleep," he said gently. "I will keep first watch." She meant to protest, to say that he had been walking all day and it was not fair, but the warmth of the fire and the long terror of the morning were already pulling her down, and she put her arm around Rosie and closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she slept without listening for footsteps. The second day on the trail was easier than the first in some ways and harder in others. Easier because the children had settled into a kind of road-born routine, Thomas and Henry taking turns on the horse while Rosie rode in front of Eli. He had lifted her up there in the morning without being asked, settling her in front of the saddle horn with a natural ease that suggested he was comfortable with small children, which surprised Clara a little and harder, because the second day was when the heat became truly serious, and the water sources were farther apart, and the road grew less defined as they crossed into less traveled territory. Eli knew this land in the bone-deep way of a man who has ridden through it many times, and he kept them moving at a pace that was purposeful but not punishing, finding shade at the worst of the afternoon heat, rationing water carefully from the 2 canteens he carried, and from a third that he had filled at the creek the day before. Henry rode beside him at one point in the late morning, the boy having decided somewhere between yesterday's camp and this morning's resumption of the trail that Eli Calloway was a person worth studying, and he had been studying him with a focused, serious intensity that reminded Clara of the way Henry studied everything he decided mattered. "Are you a lawman?" Henry asked. "No," Eli said. "Have you ever been one?" "For about 3 months in 1872, Eli said. "In Abilene, as a matter of fact. I was a deputy for a summer, decided it was not the life for me." "Why not?" "Too much of it was sitting in one place," Eli said. "Am not a man who does well in one place for too long." Clara heard this from where she was walking behind them and filed it away in the part of her mind that was paying attention to who Eli Calloway was, because in spite of herself, she had been paying attention. "My father never stayed in one place either," Henry said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, as though he was testing the water. "Your father who died," Eli said. "Yes, James Whitmore, he was a scout for the army." Henry paused. "My mother said he was a good man. Do you remember him?" "A little. He smelled like horse and tobacco." A pause. "Not Hector." The way Henry said that last part, not an explanation, just a distinction, the simple marking of a difference, made Clara's throat ache. "No," Eli agreed, and he did not press further, and Clara loved him a little bit for that restraint, and then immediately felt the absurdity of the word love having anything to do with a man she had known for one full day. On the second afternoon, they saw the dust cloud. It was far back on the road behind them, and it could have been anything: a cattle drive, a freight wagon, a group of travelers, but Eli saw it and his posture changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, a kind of focused stillness, and Clara saw him looking and felt the fear spike bright and cold in her stomach. "How far back?" she asked, keeping her voice level for the children. "A mile, maybe a little more," Eli said. "Could be nothing. Could be Hector." "Yes," he said, not lying to her. He made a decision quickly and quietly, turning them off the main road and onto a track that wound through a low, scrubby stretch of mesquite and prickly pear, moving them into the broken terrain where the dust they raised would be less visible. The children, sensing the shift in atmosphere, went quiet. Even Thomas, who had been chattering about a roadrunner he had spotted, simply closed his mouth and held on. They moved through the brush for a long hour, the sorrel picking its way carefully, until Eli judged them far enough off the main road and settled them in a hollow behind a limestone outcrop where they sat still and quiet, while the dust cloud on the road passed by on the other side of the mesquite. They waited, and Eli sat very still with one hand resting on the neck of the sorrel to keep her quiet, and Clara sat with her children pressed against her sides, Rosie's face buried in her shoulder, Thomas wide-eyed and silent, Henry perfectly composed in a way that broke her heart. The dust cloud moved north and did not turn. Eli let out a slow breath. "Freight wagon," he said finally, and Clara heard the quiet relief in it beneath the calm. The wheel pattern and the pace. A man on a horse rides different. Clara put her face briefly against the top of Rosie's head and breathed. "You can tell that from a dust cloud," Thomas whispered, all overcoming his silence. "When you have been watching trails long enough," Eli said. "Yes." They camped that second night on a low hill above a dry creek bed, and the air was cooler than the night before, carrying the first hint of a weather change coming in from the northwest, and Eli built the fire lower and oriented it so the rock face behind them reflected the heat back without broadcasting it too broadly into the dark. Clara helped him with the fire, and their hands were close together over the small pile of tinder, and she was aware of his closeness in a way that was neither threatening nor unwelcome, which was such a novel combination of those two feelings that she did not know quite what to do with it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. Why did you stop?" She asked. "You did not know us. You had your own road to travel. Why did you stop for a woman and 3 children you had never seen before?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the firelight she could see him thinking, the way some people think with their whole face and others think with almost none of it, and Eli was the second kind, just the slight shift of his eyes, the small movement at the corner of his mouth. "My mother," he said finally, "left my father when I was 9. My father was a man with a temper and a bottle, and not much else in the way of virtue. She took my sister and me and walked 4 miles to the nearest neighbor and asked them to put us in their wagon to the next town." He paused. "No one helped her until she reached that neighbor. She passed 3 houses on that road and knocked on 2 of them, and they turned her away." He looked at the fire. "Have thought about those 2 houses for 22 years. So when I see a woman at the edge of a road with 3 children and a carpet bag, I stop. It is as simple as that." Clara looked at him for a long time in the firelight. He had said it plainly, without sentimentality, without making it into something dramatic, just the simple, human arithmetic of a man who had witnessed a thing and decided not to be the kind of person who repeated it by inaction. "Your mother," she said. "Is she well?" "She died in 1871, he said. "But she had 12 years of a peaceful life after she left him, and she was happy in them. As happy as a woman can be when she has made her own choices about her own life." He paused. "That counts for something." "It counts for a great deal," Clara said. The fire settled between them, and the stars came out in their enormous Texas abundance, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sent up a long, wavering complaint at the night. On the third morning they found water at a spring that Eli knew from previous travels, and they rested there for 2 hours in the bright, clean morning, and Clara washed Rosie's hair in the spring water and let Thomas wade in the shallow pool at the spring's edge, while Henry helped Eli rub down the sorrel with a handful of dry grass. It was the first morning that had felt, even briefly, like something other than flight. It felt almost like traveling. And Clara sat on a flat rock at the spring's edge and watched Eli work with Henry, patient and even, showing the boy how to move the brush in the direction of the coat, and where the horse carried tension, and how to check the hooves for stones. And Henry was utterly absorbed, his 12-year-old face intent and serious. And she thought that this was what it looked like when a boy was taught something useful by a man who had the time to teach it. The thought came to her quietly, without announcement. She did not want this journey to end. She pushed it away immediately, because it was the thought of a woman in an impossible situation attaching herself to the nearest source of safety. And she knew that was a trap almost as dangerous as the one she was running from, and she was smarter than that. But the thought came back that evening, when Eli made a soup from the dried beef and some wild onions he found growing near the creek they camped beside. And it was the best soup Clara had eaten in longer than she could say, and the children ate it with the focused appreciation of people who have been genuinely hungry, and Eli watched them eat with quiet satisfaction. And Clara thought that this man took pleasure in feeding people, and she did not know what to do with that information, except hold it and turn it over and feel something warm and complicated about it. Rosie, who had been shy of Eli for the first day and a half, had by now completely reversed her position, and she had begun following him around the camp with the devoted determination of a small shadow, handing him things he had not asked for: a pebble, a stick, a handful of dried grass, with the gravity of a 4-year-old who has decided that what she is doing is extremely important. Eli received each offering with complete seriousness, thanking her each time, examining each pebble and stick and handful of grass with apparent interest before setting it carefully beside him. And Rosie found this so deeply satisfying that she went back again and again to find more things to bring him. Clara watched this from across the camp and felt something in her chest that she could not name and did not try to. The fourth day brought rain. It came in from the northwest, the way Eli had anticipated, a gray curtain of it sweeping across the flat land and arriving without much fanfare, just a sudden darkening of the sky, and then the smell of it, and then the drops. Eli had them shelter under a limestone overhang he had spotted an hour before it arrived, the kind of reading of the landscape that only came from years of watching it, and they huddled there, while the rain turned the trail to mud and drummed on the stone above their heads with a comfortable, percussive steadiness. Thomas fell asleep against Eli's arm with the trusting unconsciousness of a child who has decided, without examining the decision, that this is a safe place to sleep. Eli did not move, did not shift the boy away, just sat with his back against the limestone and let the small warm weight lean against him, and read the rain with the patient expression of a man who had waited out a great many storms. Clara sat across from him with Rosie in her lap and Henry beside her, and she said, quietly so as not to wake Thomas, "You are very good with them." "They are good children," Eli said. "They are," she agreed, "though they have had reason not to be." He looked at her steadily, and there was a question in his expression that he did not ask, and she answered it anyway because the rain made everything feel enclosed and private and honest. "He was not always the way he became," she said. "Or maybe he was, and I simply did not know how to see it before we were married. I was 23 and alone with Henry, and I thought practical considerations mattered more than feelings." She shook her head, not in self-pity but in the simple honesty of a woman who has thought a thing through thoroughly. "I was wrong about that. Most people figure that out before it costs them as much as it cost you," Eli said. "I am figuring it out now," she said. "Better late than not at all." The corner of his mouth moved. "That is very true," he said. Henry had been pretending to sleep, or perhaps had genuinely drifted, but he stirred now and looked at Eli with his watchful eyes and said, "Are you going to be in Abilene long?" Eli glanced at the boy. "I was not planning on going to Abilene," he said. "I was heading to Dodge City." "Oh," Henry said, and his face did a complicated thing that he immediately smoothed out, but Clara had seen it, and she felt the echo of it in herself. "Though," Eli said in the same measured tone, "Dodge City is not going anywhere." And a man who makes decisions too quickly about his own road is often a man who misses things worth seeing. Henry looked at him for a long moment. The way Henry looked at things he was assessing carefully. Then he nodded and lay back down, and Clara looked across the sleeping Thomas at Eli Calloway and felt something that was entirely too large and too soon and absolutely real, and she looked away at the rain. They reached the outskirts of Abilene on the 5th day, in the late afternoon of a clear and brilliant sky-washed day, the kind that comes after rain when everything is sharp-edged and clean, and the light has a particular quality of gold that makes the most ordinary landscape look briefly magnificent. Abilene in 1879 was past its wildest days. The great cattle drives that had made it famous had largely shifted west as the railroads pushed further, but it was still a substantial town, with real streets and real buildings, and enough commerce to support a hardware store run by a man named Davies. Clara found the store, and she found her sister. Margaret Davies, née Pearson, was 31 years old, and had her mother's gray eyes and her father's square jaw, and she opened the door of the hardware store to find her younger sister on the threshold with 3 children around her, and a tall, dark-haired cowboy standing a respectful distance back, holding a sorrel horse. And Margaret's face went through approximately 7 different emotions in the space of 3 seconds before it landed on something fierce and tearful, and she pulled Clara inside. "I wrote you," Margaret said when she had heard the broad outlines of it. "I wrote you 4 times." I know," Clara said. "I did not know. I know now." Margaret's husband, a quiet, substantial man named George Davies, listened to the situation with the careful attention of a practical person, and then said that Clara and the children were welcome to stay as long as they needed, and that they had a back room that was empty. Since his partner had moved on, and it was not large but it was enough, and he said it with the uncomplicated generosity of a man whose wife had spent 5 years worrying about her sister, and who was simply glad to help put an end to that worry. Eli had been waiting outside with the horse, giving the family their reunion, and Clara came out to find him after 20 minutes, and they stood on the boardwalk in the late afternoon light, and the moment had a kind of quiet ceremony about it that neither of them named. "My sister has room," Clara said. "George is a good man. The children will be safe." "I'm glad to hear it," Eli said. "They will not be happy about saying goodbye to you," she said. "Thomas will likely make a scene." "Boys of 7 are supposed to make scenes," Eli said. "It is part of the job." She looked at him. This man she had known for 5 days, and who had carried her children across a stretch of Texas, and who had told her the truth every time she needed the truth, and who had sat in the rain, and let a small boy lean against his arm, and who had given her his blanket, and walked beside his own horse so they could ride. She looked at him and felt the whole impractical, enormous weight of what she felt for him, and she thought about what she knew and what she did not know. And then she said, because she was, at heart, a woman who had learned the cost of not saying true things. "You said Dodge City is not going anywhere." He held her gaze for a moment, very steady and very still. "I did say that," he agreed. "I wonder," she said carefully, "if a man who has spent his life going from place to place has ever thought about what it might be like to stay somewhere." "I have thought about it," he said. "I have just never had a reason compelling enough to make me try it." She felt the warmth of that climb up through her chest, and she thought that if she had been a bolder woman or a less careful one, she might have said what she was actually thinking in plain language. But she was not bold yet. She was just beginning to learn what it felt like to be free, and so she said, "George Davies told me he has been looking for help at the store. Someone to manage deliveries in the stockroom. It is not glamorous work." "No," Eli said, "I expect it is not. But it would keep a person in one place," she said. The sun was behind him, turning the street gold, and she could see his face clearly. And what she saw in it was not the closed, measured expression he wore when he was being practical, but something more open and careful and wondering, like a man standing at the edge of a very large step. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without a formal address, just her name, plain and direct, and the way he said it made her feel entirely seen in the best possible way. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you are willing, when you have had time to breathe and to settle, and when the children have had time to feel safe." "Am in no hurry. Have been in a hurry all my life and am very tired of it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, and it was the first full, unguarded smile she had produced in she could not remember how long, and she felt it in her whole face. "I think," she said, "that I am willing." He nodded, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was warmer than one, a kind of deep, private satisfaction, and he said, "Then I will speak with Mr. Davies about that stockroom position." The months that followed were not without their difficulties. Hector Whitfield did come to Abilene, as Clara had known he would, on a bitter cold morning in November, when she was helping Margaret in the kitchen, and the children were at the school that had been established 2 streets over. He came to the hardware store first, and he found not Clara but George Davies, who had known this day might come and had arranged for the sheriff to be available at short notice. And he had also mentioned to Eli the evening before that he suspected Whitfield might arrive before the week was out. Eli was in the stockroom when Hector came through the door, and he came out calmly and stood behind the counter with his hands visible and his voice even, and he said, "Mr. Whitfield, think you should speak with Sheriff Grady before you do anything you cannot undo." Hector Whitfield was a big man, broad across the shoulders with a red face and the look of a man who had been drinking since the day before, and he looked at Eli with the particular contempt of a man who is used to intimidating people and had not yet found one he could not, and he said very slowly, "Who are you?" "My name is Eli Calloway," Eli said, "and I am asking you peacefully and once to go speak with the sheriff." What happened in the next few moments was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes make things dramatic. Hector did not draw his gun. Sheriff Grady, who had been standing at the corner of the building for the past 10 minutes, came through the door at the right moment, and what followed was a long, unpleasant legal conversation that eventually led to Hector Whitfield leaving Abilene under the clear understanding that the state of Kansas took a dim view of men who made threats, and that his claim on Thomas and Rosie was not the ironclad thing he believed it to be, particularly given the testimony of certain neighbors of the Double Cross Ranch who had, over the years, noted things they had been too afraid to say while Clara was still there and within his reach. It was not a swift or a clean resolution. There were weeks of uncertainty and a formal legal proceeding that required Clara to stand before a judge and speak plainly about her marriage, which she did with a steadiness that astonished everyone in that courtroom, including herself. In the end, she was granted a legal separation on grounds of cruelty, which was not a simple thing to obtain in 1879, but was not impossible, and Hector Whitfield went back to Texas and the Double Cross Ranch, and Clara Whitfield became Clara Pearson again, and Thomas and Rosie remained with their mother. Through all of it, Eli was there. Not in a loud or imposing way, but in the quiet, steady way of a man who had decided where he was going to be and was being there without requiring anything in return for it. He was in the courtroom on the day of the hearing, sitting in the back row, not because Clara had asked him to be, but because he had thought she might want to know he was there. He fixed things at the hardware store that George had been meaning to fix for 2 years. He spent his Sunday afternoons teaching Henry and Thomas the finer points of how to care for a horse, and how to read the weather coming across the flat Kansas sky, and how to do a dozen small practical things that men knew in that time and world. He brought Rosie a small carved wooden horse one afternoon in December, having spent 3 evenings whittling it in the back room by lamplight, and when he presented it to her, she held it with the reverence of a child receiving a sacred object, and then looked up at him with her large, serious eyes and said, "This is my horse and his name is Butterscotch." "That is a very good name," Eli said gravely. "You can name yours something too," Rosie told him, "when I make you one. I will look forward to it," he said. Clara had been watching from the kitchen doorway, and when she caught his eye she felt the warmth of it move through her from somewhere central and permanent, and she thought, very clearly, that she loved this man, and the thought did not frighten her this time. It felt instead like something settling into its proper place. Their courtship was exactly what he had promised, proper and patient, and full of an accumulating tenderness that built itself quietly out of small moments and honest conversations, and the particular kind of ease that grows between two people who have decided to be truthful with each other about who they are. He took her walking on Sunday evenings when the weather permitted, and they talked about everything about his years on the cattle trails and the friends he had made and lost, about her childhood in Missouri and the sister she had missed, and the choices she had made, and what she would do differently and what she would not. About the children and their progress at school, about the way Thomas had decided he wanted to be a veterinarian when he grew up, and Henry had announced with great dignity that he intended to study the law, about what Clara wanted for her life now that she had the extraordinary and terrifying freedom of being able to want things. "I want a garden," she told him one February evening as they walked the edge of town where the prairie began and the sky was enormous and perfectly clear. "I always wanted a proper kitchen garden. Hector said it was frivolous." "A kitchen garden is not frivolous," Eli said. "I know that now," she said. "I want tomatoes and herbs, and I want a place where the children can run and not be afraid." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have been saving money since I was 22 years old. I have not spent much on myself, being a man who lives on trail supplies most of the time. I have enough for land." She looked at him quickly. "Land," she said. "Not a great deal of it," he said, "but enough for a house and a kitchen garden and room enough for children to run." He was looking straight ahead as he said it, into the pale winter dark ahead of them, and his voice was the most careful she had ever heard it. "I'm asking, Clara, not presupposing anything. I'm asking what you think about that." "I think," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, "that you should look at me when you ask me that kind of question." He turned and looked at her, and in the thin winter starlight she could see his face clearly, serious and warm and more open than she had ever seen it, the careful, measured man who had walked her across Texas, showing her, very deliberately, everything that was underneath. "What do you think about that?" he said again, meeting her eyes. "I think," she said, "that a kitchen garden sounds like the best thing in the world. Think that I have been in love with you since you carried Rosie across a creek bed in the middle of Texas without being asked, and I have been trying to be sensible about it because I am trying to learn the difference between need and love, and I believe have learned it well enough to tell you. This is love." He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had done it, and his hand was large and warm and work-roughened, and he held hers with a gentleness that was deliberate and absolute. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you looked at me at the edge of that road in Caldwell Creek and told me about your husband and about the children, and held my gaze the whole time without flinching, as though you were daring the world to make something of it. Have never seen a braver thing." She stood there in the Kansas winter dark with her hand in his, and the stars were the same stars that had been above them in Texas, and the ground was cold and the wind was cold, and she felt completely, irreducibly warm. He asked her to marry him properly on a Sunday in April, with the prairie grass newly green around them and the cottonwoods budding pale gold along the creek. He had, with some effort and a great deal of consultation with Margaret, obtained a modest but genuinely lovely ring from a jeweler in Abilene, a slender gold band with a small garnet that caught the spring light, and he asked her in the same plain, direct way that he did everything, going down on one knee in the new grass and saying her name and then saying the rest of it, and Clara said yes before he had quite finished, and then laughed at herself for the interruption and said, "Yes, am sorry, please do say the rest." And he laughed too, which was a sound she had been stockpiling in her memory since the first time she had heard it, and then he finished asking and she said yes again. And he slid the ring on her finger and stood and took her face in both his hands and kissed her for the very first time. And it was everything that such a moment should be, unhurried and sure and full of the particular quality of a thing that has been waited for with patience and arrived at exactly when it was meant to. The children were told that evening, and Thomas immediately asked if this meant Eli was now his father, and Eli sat with him at the kitchen table and had a quiet and serious conversation in which he said that he would be honored to be called that, but that Thomas also had a father, and that the word did not have only one meaning, and that Thomas could decide for himself what he wanted to call him, and Eli would think it was exactly right whatever the answer was. Thomas thought about this for about 30 seconds and then said, "I think, Dad," and that was that. Henry was 14 by then and more complicated about it, as 14-year-olds are entitled to be, and he and Eli had a longer conversation that went on over several weeks, not in a heavy or fraught way, but in the natural, circling way of two people who are working something out carefully. What Henry said, eventually, was that he remembered his father not much, but enough, and that he was glad of that, and that he did not want to forget him. And Eli said that was not only understandable but right, and that a man's first father is part of him whether that father is present or not, and that remembering someone was not a betrayal of the people around you but a part of who you are. Henry nodded at this and then said, with the sudden directness that he sometimes deployed after a long period of careful thinking, "I am glad you stopped on that road." And Eli said, "So am I, Henry." "So am I." Rosie simply continued calling Eli by his name, because Rosie had her own systems and her own reasons, and no one questioned them. They married in June of 1880, in the church in Abilene with the crooked steeple that reminded Clara, not unpleasantly, of the church in Caldwell Creek where all of this had begun, though this one was better kept and had better pews. Margaret stood up for Clara and George Davy stood up for Eli, and Thomas wore his best shirt and stood very straight, and Rosie held a bunch of wildflowers she had picked that morning with such determined personal selection that no one had dared suggest she choose differently. And Henry stood beside his mother and gave her away with a solemnity that made 3 women in the front row quietly weep. It was a bright, warm June day with the prairie wind coming soft from the south, and the whole thing had the quality of a day that knows it is important and is behaving accordingly. Eli had bought a piece of land 2 miles outside Abilene, not large, just enough, as he had promised, and he had spent the winter and spring building a house on it, with help from George, and from 2 men he had become friends with at the grain exchange, And it was a solid, honest house with a good roof and a porch that faced the sunset, and a kitchen with a window that looked out over the plot he had already broken and turned for Clara's garden. They moved into it the week after the wedding, and Clara stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the turned earth and cried briefly and without apology, because 4 years of Hector's ranch and 6 months of Abilene and all the long road between deserved to be marked somehow, and this was how she marked it. Eli put his arm around her and stood with her at the window and did not say anything, because he understood that some moments did not require words. The first summer in their own house had the quality of something discovered rather than built. She found her rhythms in the kitchen, in the garden, in the small morning hours before the children were awake, when she and Eli sat on the porch with coffee and watched the light come up over the Kansas prairie in that slow, magnificent way it had, the sky going from black to deep blue to a kind of luminous gray, and then suddenly, brilliantly, gold. These mornings felt like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. She planted everything she had dreamed about. Tomatoes and beans and onions and herbs, sage and rosemary and thyme, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence that grew taller than Thomas by August, which delighted him enormously. She learned the particular satisfaction of putting food she had grown herself on a table where people she loved sat to eat it, and it was a satisfaction that surprised her in its depth, not because she had doubted it, but because she had not known how hungry she had been for exactly this. Eli settled into the work of the land and the occasional work at the hardware store with the same ease he brought to everything, the ease of a man who has found his pace. He was a good neighbor and a patient husband and an unexpectedly talented teacher, and Henry in particular thrived under his steady, uncritical attention in the way that a plant thrives when it is finally given the right light. By September, Clara knew she was expecting. She told Eli on an evening when the supper things were cleared and the children were in bed, and they were sitting together on the porch in the warm, cricket-loud dark, and she told him the way he had always told her things he needed her to hear plainly and directly and with her eyes on his. She saw his face change in the firelight that came through the door, saw the surprise, and then something beyond surprise, something so unguarded and full that it was almost difficult to look at. The face of a man who had spent 32 years being largely alone, encountering the word more in a way he had not previously allowed himself to expect. He reached for her hand across the porch bench between them and held it without saying anything for a long moment, and then he said, quietly and entirely honestly, "I am the most fortunate man on this earth." "That is a large claim," she said, smiling. "Stand by it completely," he said. The baby came in April of 1881, a boy, delivered in the bedroom of their house with Margaret in attendance and a doctor from town who arrived with barely enough time, and he was large and loud and entirely himself from the first moment, and they named him James. For Clara's first husband, who had been Henry's father, because Eli said that was the right name and meant it, and Clara loved him for it with the particular, specific love she saved for moments when he did something that revealed again the full measure of his character. James Calloway was a round, emphatic baby who grew into a round, emphatic toddler with an opinion about everything in his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness. And the household revolved around him in the way that households always revolve around the newest and smallest person, with Thomas becoming an expert baby minder, and Rosie becoming the world's most devoted and bossy older sister, and Henry developing, for the first time, a full and unguarded laugh. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not with the drama of the journey that had started them, but with the steady accumulation of ordinary days that are, in their sum, the true architecture of a life. Henry went east to study law in 1885. At 17, having spent 3 years preparing for the entrance examinations with a focus that impressed even his teachers, and Eli drove him to the stage in Abilene on a September morning that had just the beginning of autumn in it, and Henry shook his hand with the formal seriousness of a young man who was not going to cry in public about leaving home, and Eli gripped his hand and said, "You right," and Henry said, "Yes, sir." And then, in a moment of completely un-teenage-like vulnerability, embraced him, and Eli held the boy who had set his 12-year-old jaw on a morning of terror and walked beside his mother and held his brother's hand, and thought about the way certain moments close a circle. Henry wrote. He wrote long, detailed letters that became a kind of family newspaper, read aloud at the supper table by whoever had the best light, and he came home for Christmas and for summers when he could manage it, and he was studying to be a defense attorney with a particular interest in the rights of people who did not have much power, which surprised no one who had known him since he was 12. Thomas, who had decided in his early teens that horses were even more interesting than veterinary medicine in general, had by 16 established a clear direction, and by 20 was working with one of the best horse ranchers in central Kansas, developing a reputation for being able to assess a horse's soundness that brought people from considerable distances to consult him. Rosie grew up in the way that strong-willed, clear-eyed girls grow up, with a certainty about herself that occasionally alarmed teachers and neighbors, and was simply a source of quiet pride to her mother and Eli. She was the one who kept Butterscotch, the carved wooden horse, on her windowsill through every rearrangement of her room and every phase of growing up. And when she was 20 and about to leave for normal school to become a teacher, she picked it up from the windowsill and put it in her bag, and Eli pretended not to notice, because she was 20 and had the right to her own decisions about wooden horses. In 1883, Clara had a second child, a girl this time, and they named her Eleanor, because Clara had always loved the name and had never been allowed to use it. Eleanor came out of the womb already more serene than her brother James had been, and she proved to be a placid, cheerful child who observed the world with large, thoughtful eyes and smiled at almost everything, and who grew up to be interested in books in a way that kept the house constantly stocked with them, borrowed from the Abilene Library, and from anyone within riding distance who was willing to lend. The house that Eli had built for 2 people and 3 children grew to accommodate all of them, with the natural expansion of a home that is loved and used, and added onto thoughtfully a room here, a porch extension there, a proper root cellar that Clara had been wanting since the beginning, and that Eli finally dug in 1882, and that changed the quality of their winters substantially. The kitchen garden grew too, spreading season by season, as Clara learned more about what the Kansas soil would and would not do, and it became something of a local destination, visited by neighboring women who came for cuttings and advice, and who stayed for coffee and conversation in the kitchen, which was exactly the kind of household Clara had imagined when she had been unable to imagine the future at all. On a September evening in 1887, 7 years, give or take a few months, since the morning in Caldwell Creek, Clara sat on the porch with Eli in the cooling air and watched James, now 6 years old, chase Eleanor through the yard in the last light of the day, their voices high and bright in the prairie air, and she thought about the woman who had stood at the edge of that road with a carpet bag and 3 frightened children and a choice to make. She had made the choice. Or rather, the choice had come to meet her in the form of a man on a sorrel horse who had stopped, because he could not be one of the 2 houses that did not open the door. "What are you thinking?" Eli asked. He had gotten very good over the years at reading her silences, and he always asked rather than assumed, which she had come to understand was a specific and considered gift. "Am thinking," she said, "about a morning in Caldwell Creek in 1879. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the children playing in the yard. "Long time ago," he said. "Not so long," she said, "in some ways." He reached over and took her hand the way he always had, without ceremony and without hesitation, and held it in his warm, steady grip, and they sat there together in the settling evening while their children moved through the last of the day's light, and the prairie stretched out around them in its enormous, beautiful indifference, and the sky began its slow change toward night. "I want you to know," Clara said into the quiet, "that there has not been a single day, not one, that have not known what a lucky morning that was." He turned and looked at her, and his dark eyes had the same quality they had always had, honest and warm and direct, and seeing her completely, and he said, "Neither have I." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and the children's voices drifted through the warm air, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek a bird was settling itself for the night, and the first stars were beginning to appear above the flat Kansas horizon. James spotted something in the grass and let out a tremendous shout of discovery that startled Elena into a peal of laughter, and both of them came pelting toward the porch to show their parents whatever it was, and Clara and Eli straightened up to receive them, and the discovery turned out to be an unusually patterned grasshopper that James had captured in his cupped hands, and that he presented for inspection with the solemnity of a scientist presenting a significant finding. Eli examined it with great care, his face grave and interested, and then told James what kind it was: a differential grasshopper, common in the late Kansas summer, and James asked 11 rapid questions about it, and Eli answered each one, and Elena listened with her head tipped to one side, and Clara sat and watched the four of them in the porch light and felt the fullness of it, the complete and rounded fullness of it, like a thing that has been made right. The letter from Henry arrived that same week, written in his clear, lawyer's hand, telling them that he had taken a position with a firm in Kansas City that did work he believed in cases involving homesteaders' rights, involving fair wages, involving the small and important dignities of ordinary people, and that he had met a woman whose name was Caroline, and that he intended to bring her home for Christmas and hoped very much that they would like her, and that he was happy in a way he had not previously known he was capable of being. Clara read the letter twice, once to herself and once aloud at the supper table, and when she got to the part about Caroline, she looked up and met Eli's eyes across the table and saw his expression, which was the same one he wore whenever something confirmed for him what he already believed to be true: a quiet, private satisfaction, a kind of deep rightness, and she smiled at him, and he smiled back, and Thomas said, "Henry has a girl," with a tone that suggested this was simultaneously impossible and excellent, and Rosie, who was home for the weekend from normal school, said, "Of course he does. He is extremely marriageable," and James said, "What is marriageable?" And the supper table erupted into the particular cheerful noise of a family that argues and talks over each other, and laughs freely, and feeds each other extra helpings of things without being asked. Clara got up to refill the biscuit plate and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, listening to all of it, and Eli must have seen her face from where he sat at the head of the table, because he met her eyes above the children's heads, and the expression on his face was the one she would take to her grave as the definitive portrait of him, not his everyday face, not the polite or the capable or the watchful face, but the one underneath all of those, the open, certain, grateful one, the face of a man who knows he is exactly where he is supposed to be. She went back to the table with the biscuits. Henry came home for Christmas with Caroline, who was indeed everything the letter had suggested, and a few things it had not: sharp-minded and funny and utterly unfazed by the chaotic warmth of the Calloway household, who sat at the kitchen table with Clara on her first morning and helped shell the dried beans for the Christmas soup, and told Clara about her own family in a way that was open and easy and right, and who looked at Henry across the full table at Christmas dinner with the unmistakable expression of a woman who has found her particular person in the world. Henry and Caroline married the following spring, and their wedding had the particular quality of a young thing new to the world, which was right, and different from the older, harder-won quality of the wedding at which Henry had given his mother away 6 years before, which was also right. Thomas was at the wedding, sun-darkened and rangy and quietly content, having brought a young woman named Ada from the horse ranch who was apparently, in the casual and certain way of Thomas, simply the person he was going to marry, though they had not yet gotten around to formal arrangements. He shook Eli's hand at the wedding, and then, in the way Thomas had always done things, simply pulled him into a brief, bone-crushing embrace, and Eli caught Clara's eye over Thomas's shoulder, and his expression was entirely undone for just a moment, and she felt her throat close with happiness. Rosie taught school. She was the best teacher in her county within 2 years of starting, which surprised her students and delighted everyone who had known her since she was 4 years old, handing pebbles to a cowboy by a campfire and finding it profoundly satisfying. She kept butterscotch on the windowsill of her schoolroom, and more than one student over the years picked it up to examine it and was told, very straightforwardly, that it had been made for her by her father when she was very small, and that she had kept it because it was beautiful and because some things deserved to be kept. James grew into a tall, dark-eyed boy who was interested in absolutely everything with equal and passionate intensity: horses, and weather and mathematics and cooking, and the migration patterns of birds, and the political situation in any given territory, and who announced at 11 that he wanted to travel the whole of the West before he decided what he wanted to do with his life, which made Eli smile in the particular way of a man recognizing something of himself. Elena became a librarian. This surprised precisely no one. The house was always full. That was the thing Clara thought, on a quiet morning in 1890, sitting in her kitchen with the November light pale and clear through the window she had looked out of on the day they moved in, and cried. The house had always been full, not just of people but of something underneath the people, a warmth that was structural rather than surface, that lived in the walls and the floors and the particular smell of the kitchen in the morning when the coffee was on and the bread was in and the stove was warm. She had made this, she and Eli together, starting from a road at the edge of a Texas sunrise, and a man who had simply nodded and said yes to all 3 children. She was 37 years old in 1890, and her hair had some gray in it at the temples that she had no particular feeling about, and she was strong and well, and she had her garden and her children and her house and a man who still, after 10 years of daily ordinary life together, reached for her hand without having to think about it. Eli was 42, and the years had settled on him well, the way years settle on a man who has found his place and stayed in it, a few more lines at the corners of his eyes, a silver thread or two in the dark hair, but the same unhurried quality in everything he did, the same directness of gaze, the same capacity for patience and warmth that she had fallen in love with on a trail across Texas. They sat together on the porch on a November morning while the coffee cooled in their hands and the prairie spread out in its bare, beautiful winter state, the grass pale gold and flattened by the season, the sky enormous and blue and very clear. "I have been thinking," Eli said, out of a comfortable silence. "What have you been thinking?" she asked. "About that first morning," he said, "when I rode up the road and saw you there." "What about it?" He turned to look at her with the full, open attention he had always brought to looking at her, and she held his gaze the way she always did, completely and without flinching, the same gaze she had had on that first morning that he had told her once was the bravest thing he had seen. "I think about what it would have been," he said, "if I had ridden a different road, if I had gone south instead of north that morning." She considered this. "I suppose I would have gotten to Abilene eventually," she said. "I was very determined." "I know you were," he said. "Also know that the road was 6 miles back to town and a hard man was coming." She was quiet for a moment. "I would have managed," she said, and she believed it because she had learned to believe it. "I know you would have," he said, "but I'm very glad I did not ride a different road." She leaned her head on his shoulder in the way she had been doing for 10 years, the exact same way on that first porch evening, the weight and the warmth of it exactly familiar and exactly right. "So am I," she said. "So am I." The morning light came over the prairie in its slow, golden way, touching the frost on the grass and turning it briefly to something like diamonds. And the crows in the cottonwoods along the creek were having a loud, contentious conversation about the morning. And somewhere inside the house James was already up and asking questions about something with the full-voiced enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who does not believe in indoor voices. And Alina's patient voice was offering answers. This was the life. Not the road, not the running, not the terror of that long, dark walk away from everything. Those were the things that had happened so that this could happen. This porch, this light, this man beside her, these children inside, this garden waiting under the November ground for the spring, this fullness, this warmth, this absolute bone-deep rightness of a thing that had been earned honestly and lived in truly. Clara Calloway, who had once been Clara Whitfield, and before that Clara Pearson, who had walked 6 miles in the dark with 3 children and a carpet bag and a certainty forged from the moment. She saw her son hit a wall, put her hand in her husband's hand, and watched the morning come in over the Kansas prairie. And she was grateful, and she was whole, and she was home. The sun cleared the horizon entirely, burning off the last of the frost, and the day arrived in earnest with all its particular demands and ordinary beauties, and they went in to meet it together.